The relentless summer sun beat down on Margaret Glover's back as the hoe slipped from her calloused fingers for the third time that morning. Her body swayed dangerously, the endless rows of corn blurring before her eyes as the Kansas prairie seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Kansas Territory, 1858. Margaret had been working since dawn, as she did every day since her father's passing 3 months prior. At 22, she was now the sole caretaker of their modest homestead, a responsibility that weighed heavier than the water buckets she hauled from the creek half a mile away. The drought had been merciless this season, withering crops and spirits alike across the territory. She bent to retrieve the fallen tool, willing her trembling limbs to cooperate. Her dress, once a cheerful blue calico, now hung loosely on her frame, faded and patched in too many places to count. She brushed a strand of chestnut hair from her face, leaving a streak of dirt across her sunburned cheek. "Just a few more rows," she whispered to herself, the words a desperate prayer against the growing weakness in her body. The distant sound of hoofbeats barely registered in her consciousness until they grew louder, approaching her small plot of land. Margaret straightened, squinting against the harsh light to make out the rider coming down the dirt path that led to her homestead. Gabriel Ross had been riding for 3 days straight, his journey from Colorado Territory seeming endless under the blistering summer heat. At 26, he'd spent the last 5 years driving cattle, working ranches, and occasionally hunting bounties when times were lean. The letter from his uncle in Lawrence had arrived a month ago and offered to help run his growing cattle operation in exchange for eventual partnership. It wasn't the life Gabe had imagined for himself, but after years of drifting, the prospect of putting down roots had an unexpected appeal. He adjusted his hat lower over his eyes, scanning the landscape. According to his map, he should be nearing the Glover homestead, where his uncle had arranged for him to rest before the final stretch to Lawrence. When he spotted the solitary figure in the field, something about the way she stood made him slow his horse. She seemed to be swaying slightly, like a sapling in a gentle breeze, except there was no breeze today, just the relentless, punishing heat. He was still 50 yards away when he saw her collapse. Gabe spurred his horse forward, dust billowing behind them as he raced toward the crumpled form. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a thud as he rushed to the woman's side. "Miss, can you hear me?" He gently turned her over, alarmed by the heat radiating from her skin. Her face was flushed, her breathing shallow. Heat exhaustion, most likely. He'd seen it before among cowboys who pushed themselves too hard during summer cattle drives. Margaret's eyes fluttered open, the world swimming back into focus slowly. A man's face hovered above her, features blurred but his voice deep with concern. She tried to sit up, but her limbs refused to cooperate. "The corn," she mumbled. "I need to finish." "The corn can wait," the stranger said firmly, his calloused hands supporting her shoulders. "You need water and shade right now." Despite her weak protests, he lifted her as though she weighed nothing, carrying her toward the small cabin visible just beyond the field. Margaret wanted to object. No man had carried her since her father when she was a child, but the relief of not having to stand on her own was overwhelming. "My horse," she managed to say. "I'll tend to everything once you're taken care of," he assured her, his stride steady and purposeful. "Which way to your well?" Margaret directed him with a feeble gesture, and soon she was seated in the shade of her porch, sipping water from a ladle he'd drawn from the well. The stranger introduced himself as Gabriel Ross, explaining his connection to her neighbor Lawrence Ross, some 15 miles east. "I'm Margaret Glover," she said when her voice returned. "Most call me Maggie." "Well, Miss Maggie, you've got no business working fields in this heat without proper rest and water." His tone was gentle but reproachful. "Where's your family?" The question brought a fresh wave of grief.
"Gone.
Pa passed this spring. Mama's been gone 5 years now." Gabe removed his hat, revealing hair the color of wheat touched by sunset. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Glover." He looked out at the struggling cornfield, then back at the small homestead that showed signs of a woman's determined but overwhelmed care. "You've been managing all this alone?" Maggie straightened her shoulders, pride momentarily overcoming exhaustion. "I have. And doing just fine until this drought hit." Gabe nodded, respecting her dignity while seeing the reality of her situation. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" The question caught her off guard. She couldn't remember, honestly. The preserves were running low, and she'd been saving the last of her flour for when winter came. "I get by," she said finally. Gabe studied her for a long moment, then stood decisively. "I'll be staying the night, if that's acceptable. My uncle's expecting me, but not until tomorrow." He gestured to the field. "And I aim to finish what you started out there before the day's done." "Mr. Ross, I couldn't possibly," Gabe, he corrected. "And you're not asking. I'm offering." He turned toward his horse, adding over his shoulder, "Besides, I've been riding 3 days straight. Could use some honest work to stretch my legs." Before Maggie could protest further, he was unsaddling his horse and preparing to tend to her neglected fields. From her spot on the porch, Maggie watched this cowboy move with efficient purpose through her corn rows. His broad shoulders bent to the task she'd been struggling with all morning, making it look almost easy. Shame and relief battled within her. She should be out there. This was her responsibility, her family's legacy. But her body had betrayed her, and watching someone else shoulder her burden, even temporarily, unleashed emotions she'd been suppressing for months. By evening, Gabe had not only finished weeding the corn but had repaired a broken section of fence and drawn enough water to last several days. When he finally returned to the cabin, Maggie had managed to prepare a modest meal from her dwindling supplies: cornbread and beans, with the last precious jar of peaches she'd been saving for a special occasion. "You didn't need to use your preserves," Gabe said, seeing the open jar. "And you didn't need to tend my fields," she countered. "Yet here we are." A small smile crossed his face as he washed up at the basin she'd prepared. "Fair enough, Miss Glover." They ate in companionable silence, the simple food tasting better than anything Gabe had eaten on the trail. As dusk settled over the prairie, Maggie insisted he take her father's bed while she slept in her own small room. The propriety of having a strange man in her home hadn't escaped her, but something about Gabriel Ross's steady presence felt safe rather than threatening. "I'll be gone at first light," he told her as they cleared the table together. "My uncle's expecting me, and I've already delayed a day." Maggie nodded, ignoring the unexpected pang of disappointment. "Of course. I appreciate your help today, Mr. Ross. Truly." "Gabe," he reminded her again, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "And it was my pleasure, Miss Glover." "Maggie," she corrected with a small smile of her own. When morning came, Maggie woke to the smell of coffee brewing. She dressed quickly, finding Gabe already up and tending to his horse. He'd drawn more water, she noticed, and stoked the cook fire to life. "You didn't need to," she began. "I know," he interrupted with a grin that transformed his weathered face. "Just thought you might appreciate a hot cup before I head out." They shared coffee as the sun crested the horizon, painting the prairie in gold. Maggie found herself studying his profile, wondering about the life that had brought him to her doorstep at precisely the moment she needed help. "Will you be staying with your uncle long?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Gabe nodded, setting down his cup. "That's the plan. He's offering me a partnership in his cattle business. After years of working for others, it seems like time to build something of my own." "That sounds promising," Maggie said, genuinely happy for him while feeling her own isolation more acutely. When it came time for him to leave, Gabe hesitated, his hat in his hands. "Miss Glover, Maggie, I'm concerned about you out here alone. The work is too much for one person, especially in this drought." Pride flared in her chest. I've managed before, and will continue to. I've no doubt of your capability, he said carefully. But there's no shame in accepting help when it's needed. Before she could respond, he was reaching into his saddlebag, pulling out a folded piece of paper. My uncle's ranch is here, he said, pointing to a spot he'd marked on a rough map. If you need anything at all, that's where I'll be. Maggie accepted the map, their fingers brushing momentarily. Thank you, Mr. Ross. Gabe, he said one final time, a hint of exasperation in his voice that made her smile despite herself. Gabe, she echoed softly. She watched him ride away, a solitary figure against the vast Kansas sky, until he disappeared over the horizon. Only then did she notice he'd left something else behind, a small sack of flour and a tin of coffee on her kitchen table, precious commodities she knew he couldn't easily spare from his own provisions. The days that followed settled back into their familiar rhythm of endless work, but Maggie found her thoughts repeatedly drifting to the cowboy who had appeared like some apparition from a dream. She told herself it was merely gratitude for his timely assistance, nothing more. 2 weeks later, the drought showed no signs of breaking. Maggie's corn was struggling despite her best efforts, and game had grown scarce, forcing her to venture further from home to hunt. It was during one such expedition that disaster struck. The rattlesnake gave almost no warning before striking, its fangs sinking into her ankle as Maggie reached for a rabbit caught in one of her snares. She killed the snake with her hunting knife, but the damage was done. Pain blazed up her leg as she limped back toward home, each step more agonizing than the last. By the time she reached her cabin, her ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, angry red streaks climbing up her calf. Maggie knew snake venom when she saw it. Her father had survived a bite years ago, but only because their nearest neighbor had helped with treatment. Now there was no one. Night fell as fever took hold. Maggie drifted in and out of consciousness, the map Gabe had given her clutched in her hand. In a moment of clarity, she realized she had a choice: wait and hope the venom wasn't enough to kill her, or somehow get help. With determination born of desperation, she dragged herself to the small stable where her aging mare waited. Getting into the saddle was an ordeal that left her gasping and lightheaded, but somehow she managed it. With the map secured in her pocket, Maggie pointed her horse east and prayed she would remain conscious long enough to find Gabriel Ross. Gabe was helping the ranch hands mend fences when he spotted the rider approaching from the west. Something about the way the person slumped in the saddle sent alarm bells ringing through his mind. He was already running toward the figure when he recognized the faded blue dress. "Maggie," he shouted, reaching her just as she began to slide from the saddle. Her skin burned with fever as he caught her, her eyes glazed and unfocused. "Snake," she managed to whisper before losing consciousness entirely. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Gabe carried Maggie into his uncle's house, where Lawrence Ross's wife Martha took one look at the swollen, discolored ankle and set to work. A poultice was applied, whiskey administered when Maggie briefly regained consciousness, and cool cloths placed on her forehead to combat the raging fever. Gabe refused to leave her side, even when his uncle suggested he get some rest. "She rode 15 miles with venom in her blood," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Least I can do is stay with her through the night." Martha gave him a knowing look but said nothing, simply showing him how to change the poultice and when to offer water. Throughout the long night, as Maggie's fever ebbed and flowed, Gabe found himself talking to her, telling stories of his travels across the territories, of cattle drives and mountain passes, of starlit nights much like this one but spent alone. He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but somehow it felt important to fill the silence, to give her something to follow back from wherever the fever had taken her. Dawn was breaking when Maggie finally opened her eyes, clear and alert for the first time since her arrival. She found herself in an unfamiliar room, her injured leg elevated on pillows, and Gabriel Ross asleep in a chair beside her bed, his hand resting near hers on the coverlet. "You found me," she whispered, her voice cracked from thirst. Gabe startled awake, relief washing over his features. "You found us," he corrected, reaching for a glass of water. "Rode all this way half-conscious. Bravest thing I've ever seen." He helped her drink, his hand steady against her back. The simple kindness nearly undid her composure. "My farm," she said once she'd drunk her fill. "I need to get back." Gabe shook his head firmly. "Not until you're healed. Snake bites aren't to be trifled with, and you've got infection to fight off yet. But my crops, my animals, I've already sent 2 of our hands to look after things," he assured her. "Your mare's being well cared for here, and everything else will keep until you're back on your feet." Maggie wanted to protest further, but exhaustion pulled at her. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, her eyes already beginning to close. Gabe's expression softened. "Because you grew too weak to work the fields," he said simply, "and someone needs to carry the load while you rest." The days of Maggie's recovery passed with surprising swiftness. Martha Ross proved to be both a skilled healer and delightful company, filling the house with laughter and stories that made Maggie realize how lonely she'd been since her father's death. Lawrence Ross, a boisterous man with Gabe's same wheat-colored hair but 20 years more life etched into his face, treated her like family from the start.
And Gabe.
Gabe visited her room each morning and evening, bringing wildflowers he'd gathered on his rides and news of her homestead, which the ranch hands were maintaining in her absence. He read to her from the few books in the Ross home, his deep voice giving life to the printed words in a way that made Maggie look forward to those quiet hours together. A week after her arrival, Maggie was finally strong enough to join the family for dinner, her injured legs still bandaged, but the swelling significantly reduced. Gabe offered his arm for support as she made her way to the dining room, his touch gentle but secure. "You're looking much improved, Miss Glover," Lawrence said approvingly as Gabe helped her into a chair. "Another week and you'll be dancing at the Harvest Social." "Harvest Social?" Maggie echoed, accepting a plate of stew from Martha. "The town holds one every year," Martha explained, her eyes twinkling. "Dancing, food, a chance for everyone to celebrate before winter sets in. It's in 2 weeks' time." "Gabe will be escorting you, of course," Lawrence added with a wink at his nephew, who suddenly seemed very interested in his stew. "I couldn't possibly impose further," Maggie protested, though the idea of attending such an event with Gabe sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Nonsense," Martha declared. "You'll need to get out and enjoy yourself after all you've been through. Besides, I've been saving fabric for a new dress, and it would suit you perfectly." Before Maggie could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. One of the ranch hands burst through the door, his expression urgent.
"Fire," he announced.
Lightning strike hit the Jenkins place, and it's spreading fast toward town. The peaceful dinner dissolved into immediate action. Lawrence began issuing orders while Martha gathered blankets to soak for firefighting. Gabe was already heading for the door when he turned back to Maggie. "Stay here," he instructed. "Your leg's not healed enough for this kind of work." Maggie nodded, knowing he was right but hating the feeling of helplessness as the men mounted horses and rode toward the orange glow now visible on the horizon. The fire burned through the night, consuming 2 homesteads before the community managed to contain it. Gabe returned at dawn, exhausted and smoke-stained but unhurt. He found Maggie asleep in the chair by the window, clearly having kept vigil despite his instructions. "Hey," he said softly, touching her shoulder. She woke with a start, relief flooding her face when she saw him. "You're back. Is everyone all right?" "No casualties, thank God," he confirmed, sinking into the chair opposite her. "But the Jenkins and the Wilsons lost everything. The town's organizing helped to rebuild before winter." Maggie's expression grew thoughtful. "When I'm well enough to return home, I want to contribute. I may not have much, but I can spare some preserves, maybe some corn if the crop survives." Gabe studied her, admiration warming his gaze. Here you are, barely recovered from a snake bite that nearly killed you, and you're already thinking of how to help others. A flush colored Maggie's cheeks. It's what neighbors do. What you've done for me. The moment stretched between them, filled with words neither was quite ready to speak. Finally, Gabe cleared his throat. You should get some proper rest, he said, standing. And so should I, before Uncle Lawrence finds more work for me. That evening, as Maggie sat on the porch watching the sunset, Martha joined her with 2 cups of tea. The older woman settled into the rocking chair beside her, a knowing smile playing at her lips. He's different since he met you, Martha said without preamble. Maggie nearly choked on her tea. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Martha's laugh was warm and knowing.
Gabe.
He's been a wanderer since his parents died, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. Lawrence has been trying to convince him to join the ranch for years. He mentioned the partnership, Maggie said carefully. Yes, but what's different is that he's actually considering it now. Martha sipped her tea thoughtfully. And I can't help but notice he rides out to check on your homestead personally every day when any of the hands could do it. Heat crept up Maggie's neck. He's just being kind. Is that what they're calling it these days? Martha's eyes twinkled. When Lawrence looked at me that way 30 years ago, we were married within the month. Before Maggie could formulate a response, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced Gabe's return from town. He dismounted with his usual fluid grace, but something in his expression seemed troubled as he approached the porch. Evening, ladies, he greeted them, removing his hat. Beautiful sunset. Indeed, Martha agreed, rising from her chair. I believe I hear Lawrence calling me. Excuse me. She disappeared into the house with a speed that made Maggie suspect no one had called her at all. Gabe took the vacated chair, his expression still pensive as he gazed toward the horizon. Is something wrong? Maggie asked after a moment of silence. He turned to her, hesitation in his eyes. I visited your homestead today. A spike of alarm went through her. Is something amiss? No, he assured her quickly. Everything's being maintained as promised.
But...
He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. Maggie, I've been thinking about your situation. She stiffened slightly. My situation? The drought isn't breaking anytime soon, he said gently. And even with your leg healed, managing that place alone through winter will be. He trailed off. Difficult, she finished for him. But not impossible. Gabe nodded, respecting her determination. I know you could do it. That's not what I'm questioning. He turned more fully toward her. But should you have to? Alone. Maggie's heart began beating faster. What are you suggesting, Mr. Ross? A small smile touched his lips at her deliberate formality. I'm suggesting, he said carefully, that there might be alternatives worth considering. Such as? Gabe took a deep breath. Such as staying here, not as a guest, but as. He faltered, then pushed forward. As my wife. The words hung in the evening air between them. Maggie stared at him, certain she'd misheard. Your wife, she repeated incredulously. We barely know each other. I know enough, he said simply. I know you're the strongest woman I've ever met. I know you love your land, but shouldn't have to kill yourself trying to keep it. And I know that since the moment I saw you in that field, I haven't been able to imagine riding on and leaving you behind. Maggie stood abruptly, wincing as she put weight on her injured leg. This is absurd. You feel responsible for me because you found me half dead. That's gratitude, not, she couldn't bring herself to say the word. Gabe rose too, keeping a respectful distance. It's not gratitude, Maggie, though I am grateful fate put me on that road the day you collapsed. His voice softened. I'm not asking for an answer now.
Just think about it.
Please. With that, he placed his hat back on his head and walked toward the stables, leaving Maggie alone with her tumultuous thoughts. That night, sleep eluded her. Gabe's proposal, if it could even be called, that had awakened possibilities she'd long since buried. After her mother died and her father's health began to fail, Maggie had resigned herself to a life of solitary struggle on their homestead. The thought of marriage, of partnership, had seemed like a luxury meant for other women. And yet, here was Gabriel Ross, offering her exactly that. Not out of pity, if his words were to be believed, but out of genuine affection and admiration. The idea was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. By morning, Maggie had made a decision. She found Gabe in the barn, brushing down his horse with methodical strokes. "I want to go home," she announced without preamble. He turned, surprise and hurt flashing across his features before he schooled them into careful neutrality. "Your leg's still healing." "It's strong enough for the ride," she insisted. "And I need to see my land with my own eyes, to make sure everything's as it should be." Gabe studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll escort you." "That's not necessary. It wasn't a question," he said firmly. "I'll have the horses ready in an hour." The ride to Maggie's homestead was undertaken in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they crested the final hill that overlooked her small valley, Maggie reined her mare to a stop, taking in the sight of her home. The fields looked better than she'd expected. Someone had been diligently watering the corn during her absence. The cabin's roof, which had been developing a worrisome sag, appeared to have been repaired. Even the chicken coop had a fresh coat of whitewash. "You did all this?" she asked, turning to Gabe. He shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "Had to keep busy somehow while you were recovering." Emotion welled in Maggie's throat as they rode down to the cabin. Every corner of her small homestead showed evidence of careful attention, the kind of care that went beyond mere maintenance into the realm of genuine investment. Inside, the cabin was neat and clean, with a surprising addition. Shelves now lined one wall, filled with books she'd never seen before. "Where did these come from?" she asked, running her fingers along the spines in wonder. "Town has a small library," Gabe explained, watching her reaction carefully. "Thought you might enjoy some reading material during the winter months." Maggie turned to face him, suddenly seeing his actions in a new light. This wasn't the behavior of a man offering marriage out of obligation or passing fancy. This was someone who had paid attention to what brought her joy during her convalescence and had sought to bring that joy into her everyday life. "Why?" she asked simply. Gabe removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Because you deserve beautiful things, Maggie Glover. Even out here in the middle of nowhere." The sincerity in his voice undid her last defenses. "Ask me again," she said quietly. Confusion crossed his face. "Ask you what?" "What you asked last night. On the porch." Her heart hammered in her chest as she waited. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by cautious hope. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. "Margaret Glover," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion she could see building behind his words, "I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife. Not because you need saving or because I feel obligated, but because in the short time I've known you, I've come to admire and care for you more than I thought possible." He took her hands in his touch gentle but sure. "I'm offering partnership, not rescue. Your strength for mine. Your burdens shared with me and mine with you." Maggie looked up at him, seeing not just the handsome cowboy who had appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer, but a man who understood what she truly needed, not someone to fight her battles, but someone to stand beside her as she fought them herself. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "Yes, Gabriel Ross, I will marry you." The joy that transformed his face was answer enough to any lingering doubts. When he kissed her, it was gentle and questioning at first, then deepening with a certainty that made her knees weak for reasons entirely different than exhaustion. They were married 2 weeks later, on the day of the harvest social. Martha's promised fabric became a wedding dress of soft blue that matched the autumn sky. The entire community turned out, the recent fire and drought momentarily forgotten in celebration of new beginnings. As they danced under lantern light, Gabe held Maggie as though she were made of precious glass, despite knowing firsthand the steel beneath her gentle exterior. "Are you happy, Mrs. Ross?" he asked, the new name still sounding wondrous on his tongue. Maggie looked up at her husband, at the man who had found her at her weakest moment and had seen not someone to pity, but someone to admire. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. "And your homestead? You don't regret leaving it." They had decided to make their home at the Ross Ranch, where Gabe would work alongside his uncle while Maggie's land was leased to a young family who had lost everything in the fire. The arrangement meant her family's legacy remained intact while providing income and ensuring the land remained productive. "It's still ours," she reminded him, "just being put to good use in a different way." Gabe nodded, pulling her closer as the music slowed. "That's what I love about you, Maggie Ross. You always see the possibility in things, even when they don't work out exactly as planned." "Is that the only thing you love about me?" she teased, still getting used to hearing such words spoken aloud. His expression grew serious, though his eyes remained warm. "I love that you collapsed from exhaustion rather than ask for help, and then had the wisdom to accept it when offered. I love that you rode 15 miles with snake venom in your blood rather than give up. I love that you think of others even when you're suffering yourself." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "But mostly I love that when I said you'll rest while I carry the load, you understood that I meant alongside you, not instead of you." Maggie rose on tiptoes to kiss him, heedless of the knowing glances and approving smiles around them. In that moment, with the harvest moon rising over the Kansas prairie and the man she loved holding her close, Maggie knew that the drought would eventually break, the hard times would pass, and whatever challenges came next, they would face them together, each carrying their share of the load, neither too proud to rest when needed. And in that balance, they had found something neither had been looking for but both had desperately needed. Not just love, but partnership, forged in the harsh crucible of the American frontier, stronger for the trials that had brought them together.